The Sustainability Now Telesummit is honored to share audacious ideas and innovative solutions from more than 30 experts from around the globe. Learn how we can work together to shape a world that works. Here's your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome back to the Sustainability Now Telesummit. I am delighted to introduce to you Zach Bush, MD. Dr. Zach is one of very few triple board certified physicians in the country, and he has a very broad view that incorporates an understanding of the rise of disease and our current agricultural practices and use of chemicals and big pharma that is going to rock your world. You're in for a treat. And Dr. Zach, we are so delighted to have you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I'm thrilled to be with you, Mira, and the entire audience here. I think the Sustainability Now conference is very pertinent in its timing to the world, and thrilled to be here with you. So I'm going to take you through the last kind of 10 years of my life in its focus, but before I went into this world of kind of understanding this cross-section of health, energy, and ecology, I was in academic medicine and really pursuing what I would consider now kind of a very inside-the-box Western medicine approach with chemotherapy development on one side and diabetes management on the other. So that's my background that kind of prepared me for this. But the last 10 years have been really focused in on this intersection of nutrition and the food production systems and how they impact our capacity for human health and our risk of disease. So I'm going to take you through this kind of story that's been unfolding in our science labs in our clinics. I run a very state-of-the-art basic science lab with a fantastic team of MD PhDs and PhDs in biochemistry, cell biology, genomics, and the like. And in the clinic, I run an integrative team that spans the whole distance between 4,000-year-old Chinese medicine and herbals and acupuncture, moxibustion, and the like, all the way to cutting-edge electromagnetic field therapies and light therapies and the like. So really exciting kind of clinical and biotech side of what I get to do. And then more recently, I have really been working extensively with farmers around the world, trying to really come up with a cohesive plan for changing the way in which we manage land, especially in the food production systems, to move past organic and really get to a regenerative state of affairs, realizing that we don't have an option for sustainability right now in farming because the land is so degenerated. And so we really need to move past that in that ecology space and really move into a regenerative state where Mother Nature has the opportunity to really push us towards a situation where we produce more soil and nutrients than we consume each year. And if we don't transition to that, we're going to continue to see the massive epidemics of disease that have developed over the last just 15 to 20 years. To take a look at those, I want to show you what's kind of been happening in case this is new to your world. Autism has been the canary in the coal mine in many ways for us as physicians and public health experts to kind of wrap our heads around what's emerging with our vulnerability of disease in our greater population. Autism currently, most recent numbers coming out of 2016, showing 1 in 36 children with autism. The attention deficit disorder, obviously similar and linked to the physiology of autism. And we see this 1 in 8 children diagnosed in the United States. Many children go undiagnosed and don't even fall into those numbers. So the numbers are probably quite a bit higher than that. Asthma at 1 in 10 children, allergies that are severe and often life-threatening are 1 in 4. Diabetes, 1 in 4 adults now. Obesity at 1 in 3. Major depression at 1 in 2 adults with prevalence of major depression now. So that's a pretty astounding incidence rate, rather, over the lifetime. Major depression leading then to the kind of this chronic inflammatory state neurologically, predisposing to everything from sleep disorders, anxiety disorders, on down into things like reproductive issues. And ultimately, at the end of life, we have cancer hitting now 49% of males and females right on their tail, dementia at 1 in 1. There's an interesting statistic showing that out of a study, University of Virginia, almost 15 years ago now, so I'm concerned to see a repeat of that study to show the numbers. But even at that time, we were showing that by age 28, the population as a whole was showing decline in memory capacity and sensory processing consistent with early dementia. So a very young onset of neurologic injury in the general public towards that dementia pattern, then obviously our children are really suffering on the other end of the spectrum. To put this in perspective as to the speed at which these have been climbing in the last 2 decades, this is the chart on autism. In 1975, we see 1 in 5,000 children with autism, and that starts accelerating. By the time we're hitting 2000, we're in the 1 to 250 kind of kids with autism. And then this is 2012 when we hit 1 in 88. And then within 3 years of that, we're finding 1 in 45, and then a year later, 1 in 36. So we're on track to be doubling this rate of autism every 3 to 5 years. And this puts us at a risk of being burdened in this country and really seeing the travesty of 1 in 3 children in the United States with autism by the time we hit 2035. And so that's just a devastating number and certainly a burden of disease we can't handle. This chart depicts a similar, steady rise, not this time in neurologic, but actually in cancers. This is male and female cancers. The male's kind of leading that charge with that steeper trajectory, but female is tight on the curve there behind us. So really this rapid emergence, and that's over just the course of 1990 to 2010. So we see in these short 20-year periods, which is less than a generation, the emergence of a cancer epidemic, which really defies our understanding of how cancer happened. We used to think that the risks for cancer were passed down genetically, and cancer continues to be denoted as a genetic disease by a lot of the cancer societies around the world. They think of you don't get cancer until you get enough genetic injury, and then you suddenly have cancer. But really, it's got to be far beyond genomics to be going at this rate of rise. Currently, we can compare ourselves back to 1965. 4% of the U.S. population had a chronic disease at the time. That was from children to geriatrics. Now today, if we just look at our children alone, we have 46% of our U.S. children diagnosed with a chronic disorder or disease. So it's a stunning rate of climb that's really already undermining our productivity. I see this in my company. I've got 70 employees, and we never go a week without somebody suffering a significant setback with a family member or loss of a loved one throughout that relatively small workforce of 70 people. So we're all 1 degree of separation now from the impact of this chronic disease situation, and it's certainly impacting our productivity, our capacity to thrive, our capacity for financial wellness as an individual. The leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States is now medical costs, all the way to the fiscal collapse that we have going on the federal level. We have $3 trillion expenditure, $3.2 trillion expenditure, somewhere in that range, on healthcare currently annually, and that's expected to hit $5 trillion annually by 2022. So really rapid rising costs for both individuals and as a nation. And this is threatening our fiscal capacity to keep growing our economy. It'd be one thing if we just had disease, but that disease burden is always met and reflected in a declining production. Now imagine a society where 1 in 3 children have autism. You can imagine how many resources and the cost of care of just that one condition within the next 15 years. And so we've got a desperate need to sort things out. And if all of these diseases had emerged individually and had all kinds of different pathophysiologies and root causes, I would throw in the towel. I would give up hope. I would literally move myself to a remote island and live as happily as I can until humanity really disappears. We're on track with our current trajectory of chronic diseases to lose fertility as a species and disappear within the next 70 to 100 years. And so these stunning numbers, the stunning rate of disease, the stunning collapse of our capacity to sustain is really hopeless until you realize that all of these diseases emerged at exactly the same era. And so we had this sudden rise in the mid-1990s of all of these conditions that have now gone kind of logarithmic in their growth. And so that is reassuring in that it would suggest that there's really one root cause behind all of this. I'm going to posit to you today that the root cause is in the microbiome itself, which is a description of bacteria, fungi, parasites, viruses, all of these small organisms that make a diverse ecosystem that really vastly outnumber the number of, biologic kind of presence of our larger species, everything from our domesticated animals to wild animals to humans ourselves. We're so vastly outnumbered by not just the sheer number, but the volume of life in this microbiome environment. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit. First, I want to give you a sense of my background coming from chemotherapy development and cancer research. How did I get myself into this environment of research? And it came down to this transition that was happening in the late 2000s that was starting to suggest that somehow the bacterial patterns that we had in our gut, our skin, was starting to be able to correlate really closely to which type of cancers we got as humans. And this was defying and flying in the face of all understandings of pathophysiology of cancer at the time. And so again and again, we were finding, oh, wow, we can correlate this person's microbiome, and if they are clearly missing or have depleted these specific species, and they have breast cancer. And we were able to start to show, predictive capacity. If you do genomics on the gut and you're missing these species, you'll get colon cancer. Or if you're missing these species, you'll get breast cancer. Or you're missing these species, you'll get prostate cancer. So these correlations were starting to become very clear through university research around the world. And it was challenging my concept of how cancer was happening. And simultaneously, I was developing a nutritional kind of understanding that really the underpinnings of my chemotherapy, which was coming out of vitamin A compounds, kept tying me back to nutrition as the ultimate source to prevent cancer and perhaps even to treat disease as advanced as cancer. And so I left in 2010 and started a nutrition center. And over the last 10 years, we've seen this extraordinary speed at which the industry at large has come to realize that all of those diseases that I just told you about, from autism all the way to cancer and dementia, all of those have now been tied back to the microbiome. We now see that those are all rooted in this relationship between the gut-brain axis, the role of the microbiome, not just in the way in which neurology functions, but in the way in which our immune system itself functions and the rest. This extraordinary study starts to show us that this microbiome environment, this kind of organic garden of the human body, is in no way limited to the colon and the small bowel and the skin and maybe the nasal sinuses as we had previously thought. Instead, we're starting to realize every organ system is nursemated by specific bacteria. In this case, they were biopsying the breast of women with breast cancer to find out that there was a dominant species of bacteria. There were multiple species present, but the dominant species over and over again in each of these breast cancers was this Methylobacterium radiotolerans. Methylobacterium is a kind of stress response bacteria. It'll move in when there's a lack of oxygen, lack of nutrients. It's kind of like a weed in the garden. It shows up when there's stress and damage done. But this correlation was so high between this bacterium and the cancers that people started to wonder, is it possible that cancer is simply an infectious disease? The wrong bacteria moves in there and starts to cause inflammation and moves the patient towards disease. So in this study, they went on to biopsy the healthy breast in the same women. So breast cancer on one side, biopsy Methylobacterium. On the other side, once biopsy, they proved that the healthy breast was teeming with bacteria with a dominance of Sphingomonas, which is a totally different species and is actually an aerobic bacteria that is going to thrive in a healthier breast environment. And so shocking to find out that human breast is full of bacteria and thriving kind of balance of ecosystem in this organic garden of healthy tissue. And as stress occurs and develops, the microbiome has to shift. To see if, in fact, the Methylobacterium was correlating with the rate and severity of disease of the cancer, they then did this amazing correlation with the burden of, or the amount of, that Methylobacterium in the cancer and the rate at which it would progress and hurt or be harmless to the woman. And in the end, they were able to show definitively that the less Methylobacterium present, the more aggressive the cancer got. Those tumors that they could find almost no bacteria in were the ones that went on to rapidly kill the woman with metastatic disease and the rest. And so an extraordinary study really showing this intrinsic relationship between cellular health and recovery and the microbiome. And if we challenge that microbiome all the time, we start to realize that we lose the ability to do repair. Again, this slide is emphasizing that most of our cancer institutes out there, American Cancer Society and the like, love to use this framework that cancer is the most common human genetic disease. And they understand the transition from a normal cell to a malignant cancer cell is driven by these changes to a cell's DNA, also known as mutations. And so it begs the question of, if mutations we know are part of this pathophysiology and biochemistry, what if we take a step back and just ask a bigger question about the genome and DNA is, what is the DNA and how does it interact across species? And is it possible that if bacteria of one sort can predict the occurrence or the protection against a cancer, is there some intrinsic relationship between the genome of one bacteria and its species to the human species and its ability to repair or prevent disease? And so this is a fascinating new challenge. Again, emphasizing that this is our trajectory of cancer to suggest that as we kill microbiome, as we damage the ecosystem at large, our cancer rates go up. And so I want to give you a quick glimpse of the current kind of cutting edge understanding of how vast this microbiome is in regard to its genomics. We're going to start with the human. Each human has 1 meter of DNA, about the length of my arm, and that meter of DNA is wrapped inside of each of my cells. I have roughly 70 trillion human cells. That is a massive, massive number. Remember, a trillion is 1,000 billion, right? So you've got somewhere around 70 trillion cells that are containing this meter of DNA. And that meter of DNA is wrapped in a complex structure that we call chromosomes around these things called histones, which are like kind of balls of yarn, if you will, with the DNA all wrapped up. Imagine a meter-long string of DNA now having to be packed down into the nucleus of each of your cells, and that nucleus is somewhere around maybe 10 times smaller than the circumference of your human hair. And so you have this extremely tiny structure of the nucleus that has to envelop not only the DNA, but all of the machinery that would unpack the DNA, find a specific gene, turn that gene into RNA, move that through enzymatic transfer out into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it will then turn into a protein, a building block for the cell itself, or a building block for enzymes, that kind of sort. And so this genome wrapped into every single cell has an extraordinary capacity for knowledge, really. It's this master blueprint. And if we kind of multiply this out, 50 to 70 trillion human cells, multiply that out times a meter of DNA, it turns out that you could wrap the DNA in my body alone around Mother Earth 2 million times. And so that gives you a sense of just how fast the amount of genomic information is in our body. However, it turns out that very little of that DNA, 1%, maybe 1.5%, of your DNA actually codes for your genes that makes you specifically human. Your genes, it turns out, are only numbered at 20,000 genes. This is a very, very low number, far lower than we were expecting by like 10x. We thought we were going to find 280,000 genes because we knew we had way over 200,000 proteins to build a complex human body. Find out that there was only 20,000 was kind of dismal because we'd already figured out that a fruit fly has 13,000 genes and the flea, that tiny little insect, has 30,000 genes. So to find out that humans lay somewhere between fruit fly and flea, and quite frankly a little closer to the fruit fly, is kind of a stunning and ridiculous finding. And this was kind of 1990s, late 1990s that this information started coming out. And we had to completely take apart our belief system about DNA, that famous double helix from Watson and Crick that won them the Nobel Prize and everything else. We had been told that this was the template for life. This is how a species would determine who and what it is by this strict use of its genes. Well, that had to fall apart because suddenly we figured out that somehow there must be some other influence outside of the DNA that's causing those 20,000 genes to be able to produce over 280,000 different protein types. the equivalent to this, is perhaps if you think of like a blueprint for a house. A blueprint for a house is widely understood to be the instructions on how to all the way down to the doorknob, build that house. Now imagine a blueprint that you could pick up, and from that blueprint, you could build 200 vastly different houses. That's a very cool dynamic blueprint that somehow has the ability to do some decision making at many, many parts in the journey of that template. And so it starts to be less like the template for life and more like a warehouse of supplies. Okay, here's what a doorknob looks like. Here's what trim looks like. Here's what a roof looks like. But you can do anything you want with those varied parts, and you can build any variation of house therein. If you multiply this out at the genetic level, you realize that with the flexibility of each of our genes and 20,000 genes present, we could build over 2 million different bodies. That's really exciting. If you feel that you have a disorder or dis-ease, or your children are suffering with anxiety and fatigue or whatever it is, and you're like, how can this possibly be? The reality is your child or yourself can go on to build 2 million other variants of the body that they're living in with the flexibility of their genome. And so this is a profound story of flexibility ultimately. I want to now expand out from the human and give you a sense of where are we at in understanding the rest of the DNA. Because to date, we've called it junk DNA. That other 99% of your genome that wraps around Mother Earth 2 million times, that we've just gone on to just assume it must be junk because it doesn't make proteins, which is a little bit of a leap of massive faith, because if you look at that beautiful nature outside, it's pretty obvious there is no junk. Nature doesn't do junk. Nature has a way of having great purpose and function in everything that it designs, and there's an interconnectivity to that nature, and there's a purpose of regeneration and cooperation and co-creation within that nature, and we've just dismissed that in this genomic world. And to this year, even some of the best labs coming out of the NIH and Harvard and the rest are publishing papers about junk DNA and how it's leftover material from our maybe emergence from a single-celled organism to complex human cells, and there's just leftover junk. And so it's just fascinating to me how really brilliant people can be led down this pathway of denial around how brilliant nature really is. And so again, I think that's more of a problem with our education system and kind of the matrix of what dogma looks like in that academic world, and it's not intellectually anything. Like it's so intellectually inconclusive and dark that you can't even really put an argument to it other than pointing out that that's ridiculous. But I want to now move past that and say, well, what could that junk DNA be doing? And we now have a good sense that a large portion of it, at least, is coding for this thing that we call microRNA. The exciting thing about microRNA is, number one, it's tiny in its structure. That's why we had never found it before, because it took us a long time to have the detection equipment. This is kind of like discovering that there's other galaxies with a better telescope. As microscopy and as our ability to find nucleotide sequences that are tiny in the cell, we started in the last 5 years to emerge with this realization that, oh my gosh, there is a ton of data in the bloodstream and inside the cell that's coming from some sort of nucleotide DNA source. And lo and behold, all these microRNA are tiny little signaling systems that are coming out of the quote unquote junk DNA. The exciting thing about that tiny nature of these is the fact that they can leave the cell. Messenger RNA that goes on to code a protein from one of your genes never leaves the cell. It's a very large strand of nucleotides, and it has to stay within the cytoplasm of the cell. MicroRNA not only can exit the cell into the bloodstream, they can exit your body, which is fascinating. And so with every breath you take, with the saliva in your mouth, with the urine, with your stool, you are excreting these tiny little envelopes of microRNA that can then travel through the air and settle on things and actually swap genetic information as to what's going on in your body right now. The microRNA that is from your DNA that's circulating in your bloodstream right this moment is actually derived from the genes that are being, the DNA near the genes that are being turned on today. So if you have a peaceful, wonderful day, you're turning on all of this kind of pro-regulatory pro-growth kind of genes, and the microRNA are coursing through the bloodstream saying, all is well, there's no stress, there's no lack of food, there's no lack of sleep, organism is ready for reproduction, organism is ready for positive production of muscle, whatever it needs. And so this is the kind of the microRNA message of all is well. You have a super stressful day, you miss a couple nights of sleep, you get the flu, now you have a completely different genetic milieu going on as far as which proteins you're making and the rest. And to mimic that or to mirror that and communicate that to the greater world, you've turned on totally different microRNA messengers that will go out and tell the greater scene what your situation is to prepare everybody else around you for that situation. The interesting thing about this plasticity of our genome is that as these microRNAs settle in on your genome from someplace else, they will change the gene behavior, helping to determine which of those 200 different options each gene has, which protein is that gene going to make? And the environment and its microRNA contributions are really developing that. So with that single gene, again, 200 different proteins from a gene go on 4 million different variants of your body today, all being encoded and predicted as to that plasticity through these microRNA that travel far. The exciting thing that we see as we tie this back into the microbiome is that we already, even though we've only begun to understand the microRNA and measure the microRNA coming from the microbiome, we've already discovered that 15% of the microRNA in your bloodstream today is from bacteria. Another 15% is from the fungi in your environment. Another 5% is actually from the food you just ate. The DNA in the muscle of the chicken that you just ate has microRNA that's telling you about the status of that chicken when it died, which unfortunately was horrible. That chicken, by and large, was under a horrific situation, beak cut off, never seen the sun, never scratched in the dirt, has eaten nothing but genetically modified grains, has no idea what grass tastes like, doesn't know what the sunshine feels like on its feathers. This is an isolated, suffering animal, has already lost a third of the flock to invasive E. coli and salmonella within that building. And so it's just horrific, full-on Holocaust-like situation for this chicken. And you can imagine the microRNA that have turned on in that animal. It is stress, it is fear, it is a sense of hopelessness. All of these things are coursing through this chicken, and of course, enormous immune overload, sense of inflammation, all these things. And that's now coded in that piece of chicken that ends up on a chicken sandwich or a chicken salad. And the woman goes in benignly thinking she's taking care of her health by ordering the healthy chicken salad and ends up with this microRNA in her bloodstream minutes later that's telling her, nobody cares, you're totally isolated, you're totally lonely, you are being abused, you don't know why. And she suddenly goes into this full-on generalized panic attack and doesn't know why. I increasingly believe in my clinic that I am seeing the direct influence of food and its messages in the women that are showing up in my clinic with this extremely high prevalence of generalized anxiety and panic attack. I think they are just the sentient, emotional expression of the greater ecosystem that they interact with, primarily through their food, but also through the breath and other environments. And so the food we eat, the bacteria that we touch, the fungi that we breathe, all of this is contributing to our plasticity. Now I want to give you a sense of how big that microbiome is compared to you and your human species. So we've got this human species, one species, 20,000 genes. We should have interaction with 40,000 species of bacteria. That's 2 million genes. We should have interaction with 300,000 species of parasites around the world. That is an extraordinary number with 2 billion genes. We should have interaction with 5 million species of fungi on the planet. And it turns out they have 125 trillion genes. And so as you start to just look at their genetic information compared to our measly 20,000 genes, we're almost non-existent on this planet from a sense of genetic contribution, which is fascinating to me. It means this planet, when we think about life on this little tiny blue dot in the middle of black space with billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, again, just reminding you of the grandiosity of this universe that we live in and the humility that we should have around what our species is and what our relationship to the greater ecosystem should be. We should take up no less than, a small fraction of the resources Mother Earth has for ourselves, because life itself is actually based in this fundamental soil, if you will, this fundamental organic substrate of the ecosystem and communication between this vast microbiome. Finally, I want to bring you into the reality of viruses. Viruses, we haven't even begun to be able to categorize how many species. Certainly in the tens of millions of species, probably in the hundreds of millions of species. And amazingly, we have a sense now of how many viruses on Earth, and a very conservative version of that number is 10 to the 31. That is a 1 with 31 zeros after it. That vast number is actually 10 million times larger than our stars in the entire universe, not the galaxy, in the universe. And so there are just no other numbers out there in the grandiosity of the universe that would really kind of bring you into the understanding of just the vast amount of virus that lives in and around us. We are increasingly finding out that we are full of retroviruses, which are in the family of that is HIV that causes AIDS. So we're starting to realize viruses are not inherently bad. Bacteria are not inherently bad. Fungi are not. In fact, there is no inherently bad part of this vast ecosystem. If any of this ecosystem was against us, we would simply be dead. There is no way we can compete with this volume of life on Earth. And we have to remind ourselves that this evolved over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And we have only evolved with this ecosystem over maybe the last 180,000 years, as our fossil record of Homo sapien would suggest. And so we are very recent newcomers to this biology. And this biology could not have been fighting against us over the last 180,000 years. We would have never emerged. We would have just been kept at bay. And so the fact that we've been allowed to emerge would suggest that all of these have the capacity to not only be in parallel with us, but actually be synergistic with human health itself. So if we back up on this planet, we're going to realize that the entire planet is our gene pool. And if we continue to have this attitude of we need to kill it in farming, we need to kill it in medicine, we need to kill it with our antimicrobial soaps as soon as you walk into the kindergarten room, if it's just kill to this great gene pool of the microbiome, we will all die. That's as simple as I can make the equation at this point. If all of this is correct, then we should see an incredible correlation between antibiotic use and death from cancer. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. So this map from the Centers of Disease Control, the red states, followed by the orange states, followed by the yellow and the white, are the hottest areas of cancer death. Over here, kind of opposite color scheme, but the darker the blue here, the more antibiotics are prescribed. And you'll be able to see a state-by-state perfect correlation in the deep south up into the east here. You'll see this state-by-state perfect correlation with the more antibiotics we prescribe per 1,000 persons, the more people die of cancer in those states. So a stunning recognition that we can contribute to the risk of cancer death through killing the microbiome. But it's important to look back historically before we make any conclusions that doctors are causing cancer with antibiotics and say, well, something really fundamental shifted in this map. So if we go back to the CDC maps dating back to 1970, 1994, this was the dominant pattern. We were dying of cancer in the Northeast. This is from colon cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer in the Northwest. And so we had this dominance of cancer death in the Northeast, never in the South. And then suddenly, between 1994 and 2007, in that brief 13-year period, we completely reversed the cancer map in the United States. To do that, we had to cause an ecologic damage or an environmental injury to humans that is nigh on to Chernobyl or worse, to be able to change our demographics of cancer that fast across the diversity of genomics of our population in the United States, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian, Eastern and European, African. We have this incredible melting pot of genomics, and yet this quote-unquote genetic disease suddenly flips its pattern, not only rising to an incredible degree of incidence, its pattern of occurrence and the risk to death has completely shifted in that brief 13-year period. So we did something profound there. And if we look back at these New England Journal of Medicine articles, we can find that our rate of prescriptions per state have stayed very stable over that period of time. There's been no rise in antibiotic usage in that United States. the amount is pretty gross. We're prescribing 7.7 million pounds, not prescriptions, pounds of antibiotic to men, women, and children in the United States, which equates to 833 prescriptions for every 1,000 persons in the United States every year. And so that is an extraordinary, penetration of antibiotic usage. Nonetheless, it had been stable over that 20-year period, and so something else fundamentally changed. And I'm going to posit to you today that what changed is this chemical here. This happens to be the most prevalent antibiotic on the planet now. It's called glyphosate. Glyphosate, interestingly, is the active ingredient in the famous weed killer Roundup. It has never been patented as a weed killer. It's been patented as an antibiotic, antifungal, antiparasite. It loves to kill the microbiome. It's one of the main mechanisms by which I think it depletes soils and kills weeds, is by this destruction of the microecosystem. This antibiotic is known to work through a very specific pathway called the shikimate pathway. And we've been told by the chemical companies, Monsanto, Bayer now, and all of the other chemical companies in the world that make this chemical, the vast majority now being made as a generic chemical out of China. Glyphosate has been told by all the chemical companies is safe for humans because we don't have this enzyme pathway. Well, that's great. It only occurs in bacteria, fungi, the microbiome, and plants. And so it turns out that, yeah, okay, we don't have the direct target that Monsanto tells us this thing works through, but we didn't then go on to perhaps ask the deeper question of, well, what does that enzyme pathway do, and why would that be pertinent to human health? And it turns out this enzyme pathway makes the aromatic amino acids. The aromatic amino acids, of course, are those that we call the essential amino acids. These are the ones that we cannot produce from our own genome or from our own protein synthesis. We rely entirely on that outside environment of our food chain and beyond, and the bacteria in our gut to produce these compounds. Without these, we can't. These include things like phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan. We cannot do healthy reproduction. We cannot do healthy endocrine system. We cannot do healthy neurotransmitters. We cannot produce these things that are fundamental to our health. And so how short-sighted to say it's safe because it can't hurt us directly, to realize it can hurt us indirectly by simply removing the building blocks for life from our food system, in which we had so long recognized that food is our medicine. Food is, in fact, the source of all of this. So those amino acids go on to make really the most fundamental portions of our endocrine system and our neurologic system, and make us cooperative and, in fact, really coordinate our reactive capacity to threat. So if we get damaged, the abundance of these building blocks allow us to respond with an acute inflammatory event that makes us stronger, not weaker. And so we should get stronger with any challenge. This is the whole kind of concept of, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And that's exactly true in biology, as long as you're in acute inflammation pattern of maintenance. If you start to lack building blocks and you start to lose the substrate for life, we start to transition from an acute inflammatory response system to a chronic inflammatory degenerative state where we can no longer respond effectively, and we get weaker with every response rather than that stronger phenomenon. And so we have really undermined our resilience as a species and as a planet as a whole through the widespread use of this chemical. 1992, we had to be very sparing with our spraying pattern. That's the spraying pattern throughout the United States. You can see the obvious dominance there in the Midwest, where we have the bread basket of the world, we call it. But of course, we don't grow anybody else's food. We actually make the world feed us. So we import the vast majority of the food we eat. We only export commodities that turn into plastics and fuel and things like that, typically. Most countries out there in the developed world are starting to refuse to receive any of our grains. Germany, for example, refuses any North American grains. They will only take grains from the Ukraine and Russia because it's the only place they can find clean production of those. That our production is so dirty because look at the volume by 2011 of Roundup that we're spraying onto those crops. Why is that? Because we genetically modified our crops to be Roundup ready so that we could directly spray this. So no longer were we spraying weeds, we were directly spraying our crops. Predating the 1996 GMO event where we started to coat our corn and soybean, in 1992, we actually started spraying wheat directly. And this is really weird and a foolish decision probably, because in the end, in 1992, we see the emergence of a new phenomenon called gluten sensitivity. And with every extra acre of wheat that we spray every year since 1992, there's been this steady climb of the prevalence of acres sprayed with glyphosate. Keep in mind, they're spraying that not to kill weeds, not to improve crop yield or anything. They're only spraying it to kill and dry the wheat faster so that they can get more to market quicker. So it's just a pure, kind of greed and convenience factor that the farmers are using this. And they're not using it as a weed killer because it's actually being marketed to them as a desiccant or a drying agent. And so in the farmer's mind, they're spraying a drying agent. They have no idea they're spraying, this potent antibiotic and chemical disruptor of protein structure onto the wheat that we're about to consume. So imagine spraying a field, it dies in 3 days and dries out, and now you can go and harvest that. Well, that saves you potentially many weeks of time, because you were going to have to wait for that to dry out over its normal life cycle. Lots of problems in there, including you now have a grain that never was allowed to dry out and change its protein to carbohydrate ratios, fiber ratios, and everything else to the age-old qualities that it should have had. And we see this again and again with gluten sensitivity populations. If they go over to Europe, they can suddenly eat a croissant and have absolutely no problem. They come back here in the United States, they eat one bite of pasta, and it takes them 3 days to recover from the brain fog and bloating and everything else that they're going to experience. And so we see again and again that the presence of this chemical is really damaging to the system. You'll notice that there's not a perfect correlation between this dense spraying pattern in the north, all the way up to the Dakotas and Minnesota and all of this, and this cancer dominance down here in the south. Until, of course, we overlay this map. I found this map some months after discovering these, and it turns out that this is a picture of the tributaries of the Mississippi River in red. In white, you see the vague outline of the United States there, and in red, you realize we are capturing 85% or so of the glyphosate that's sprayed in this country into a single water system. And unfortunately, Roundup is a water-soluble toxin. This means that you're going to see this thing going not only onto the crops and into the soils, it's going to go into the runoff, it's going to go into the river system, and ultimately end up in the ocean. If we look at the prevalence of disease compared to those spraying maps and everything else in the Mississippi River, we see a huge overlay, not just with cancer, but this is the mental health map. This river system is the Mississippi, very high density. One other river up here captures all the Roundup in the whole Northwest, where we see a lot of our growing of our root vegetables, right? So this is the vast majority of our potato crop. This is where we grow a lot of our apples and the rest, all sprayed with glyphosate, again, all collected in a single river system. So we see another hot spot of cancer up there. And so Northwest and deep South with these river patterns, not only cancer, but in this case, mental health disease emerging. Going beyond mental health, now looking at infectious diseases, we see the same pattern of tick-borne disease coming into this dominance around this dense area of prevalence in the water system. We are now spraying around 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate worldwide. That's equal to 4.5 billion pounds of this chemical going into our soils and water systems around the world. As soon as it hits the soil, one application that we've seen with our farmers, one application of Roundup across the farm kills 50% of the earthworms in the soil. That is the workforce for that farm in regard to soil maintenance management and building of nutrients in the soil. One application. And unfortunately, farmers are trained to spray multiple times a year after year after year. And now we see farms that have no measurable earthworm population and have dead, compacted soil that require enormous amount of dollar inputs and chemical inputs to get any kind of life growing out of it. And so we have changed our farmers into, instead of kind of co-creative stewards of the land, they are now just purveyors of chemicals and chemical fertilizers to keep themselves sustaining. So it's just been a devastating pattern. I need to quickly tie this back in with inflammation and the concept, because we know that all chronic disease somehow is going to tie back to the concept of chronic inflammation. So I want to quickly give you a sense of what is it that protects the body from outside attack from chemicals or man-made or non-man-made compounds in our food, and how would that relate to inflammation? Turns out that our protection network is made of a single protein called a tight junction. Here you can see this kind of loop-like, Velcro-like structure that is involved in this tight junction that will tie one cell wall to the next cell wall. This allows something like your gut lining depicted here to have billions and billions of these tiny epithelial cells with finger-like projections that should absorb your food to bond together into this single barrier system. If we damage that tight junction system, we get leak between the cells, and we no longer have intelligent barrier or gatekeeper, we just have a leaky sieve. And now the immune system that lies right behind that gut lining, some 70% of your immune system right there, has to now react to everything you eat and drink because something's going to sneak through there in an unregulated fashion. Unfortunately, that doesn't stop at the gut. Turns out that all of your blood vessels are made of something called endothelium, and it's also tied together by the same Velcro. And so as we damage tight junctions, we see a massive leak of the blood vessels, which means we cannot hydrate our cells well. We end up with stasis in our lymph system, edema and water retention, and then it doesn't stop there. It turns out that our blood-brain barrier that protects our central nervous system and our peripheral nerves depend on the same tight junctions, so we get leaky brain. And it turns out finally that the kidney tubules that are responsible for ejecting and clearing any toxins that end up in the bloodstream out of the body are also depend on the same tight junction structure. And so we become leaky sieves on the front end, we become leaky vessel, leaky brained, and we can't get the toxins out because we fail to make those high electrical tight junctions in the kidney tubules, and we can no longer clear the body of the toxin. And so we end up as being sinks or sponges for toxin in our environment as we damage these tight junction systems. And lo and behold, this has been the area of expertise of our laboratory. Dr. John Gilday has been our leading expert in this, and he has shown over and over again that if you add Roundup to a small intestine or colon, it goes from this nice zippered together tight junction system where each cell is zippered tightly to the next. Suddenly everything falls apart and you have individually floating cells that are no longer attached within minutes of exposure of glyphosate. This means that the leaky phenomenon is now exposing that immune system to this vast injury. Here in purple now, you see the cross-section of the gut, and the gut has these finger-like projections, and deep in those fingers then, right past that single cell layer that is the protective epithelium, you have that purple pulpy material, which we call the GALT, or the gastrointestinal lymphoid tissue. And that's where some 80% of the antibodies that are made in your body will go on to be produced. Those antibodies are fighting against the foreign material. And so we see the gut as our primary exposure to the outside world, covers 2 tennis courts in surface area versus just the 1.8 meters of the adult skin. And so just some 10x the size of your skin exposure is your gut exposure. And so that gut becomes your front line of defense and your ground zero of damage when we start to get leaky membranes. I should mention on that slide, actually, because I had referred to it earlier, the black line depicts the number of acres of wheat sprayed with glyphosate every year, and in the yellow bars is gluten sensitivity in the form of celiac disease, which is the autoimmune condition. And so you can see that celiac disease was nearly non-existent in our population as of 1990. 1992, we start spraying, we start to see a couple of bars rising, and then we start to see every year increasing amounts and this steady climb over the course of time in that autoimmune disease. In our labs, we've now shown the mechanism by this, which is if you take a vehicle or control membrane, it holds a very high electrical charge or resistance against the outside world, very protective. If you give it a gluten at about the amount that you'd see in a big slice of pizza, you would see about a 20% decline in the function of that membrane. I think historically this was a rate of repair that we were able to maintain. If you take a tiny bit of glyphosate, the amount of glyphosate you would see in the residuals on wheat or the amount that you would see in a typical glass of water, tiny bit of glyphosate in there, you can see also that decrement or loss of protection. But what we've shown is if you put that tiny bit of glyphosate in with that tiny bit of gluten, you see a massive collapse, 80% loss of your protective membrane, and now you're a leaky sieve. And so we believe in our laboratory and in our clinics that the emergence of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease are the direct result of a simultaneous exposure to gluten and glyphosate in the same bite of food. And so this we prove over and over again by sending our patients out of the country to clean grain environments and see their health really turn around rapidly. Of course, we have to remember that there is a huge gut-brain connection here, and that when we see gut inflammation starting to occur, it always results in symptoms of the brain. If we look across the lifespan of leaky gut and leaky brain, this is how it presents. And so I see in my 0-year-old children, within the first couple of weeks of life, colic. They can't sleep, they have bloating, they have belching, they can't swallow well, they have GERD, got all of this digestive problem, irritable bowel, they're cranky all the time, crying throughout the day. That kid already has leaky gut, leaky brain, and is showing mom and dad signs of that. Colic has now become epidemic in our pediatric population. Sensory processing deficits. This can be as minor as kind of just a little bit of delay in developmental milestones and some attention deficit, a little bit of hyperactivity, some flapping, stimming kind of things, all the way to autism spectrum disorder injury, which typically happens between 18 months and 2 years of age. And so that big neurologic injury now, if you escape that, we start to see the brain emerging with anxiety disorders, especially in young girls around age 10. And by the mid-teens, we see the major depressive episodes really starting to affect males even more than females. Anxiety is still rising in the females over the teen years. And then we get into the sleep disorders. Sleep disorders are extremely prevalent by college age, and we see a lot of kids in my clinic that are dropping out of college because of chronic fatigue syndromes, chronic pain syndromes that are emerging from chronic sleep deficits due to this collapse in the neurologic sensory processing and endocrine systems. Next up, we see insulin resistance emerging in our 20s. An extraordinary little study was done by a journalist in Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, he just grabbed a glucometer from a local clinic and started randomly walking around the streets, kind of like we see our night TV hosts doing out there on the street. And he was just saying, "Hey, can I check your blood sugar?" He checked 100 people out there on the streets of Philly none of them ever really had their blood sugar checked. And it finds that he's got at least a third of them with diabetes level blood sugars, and they don't even know it. And so you got a third to 40% of our patients walk around Philadelphia not even realizing they have diabetes range blood sugar. So diabetes is so prevalent now in our 20-something, 30-something-year-old crew. Also emerging in our 20s and 30s is the autoimmune diseases, which is a direct result of that gulf, that immune system of the intestines getting overwhelmed and producing all of these antibodies that will then go on to try to target the outside world and inadvertently cross-react with some tissue in your body, causing rheumatoid arthritis of the joints or type 1 diabetes, or most commonly the Hashimoto's thyroid conditions or Graves' disease of the thyroid. And then we see autoimmune adrenal disease. I actually am seeing this really often in farmers now who see really high rates of Roundup exposure, obviously. And so a really fascinating kind of relationship between autoimmune disease. And we could go deeper on this maybe in future talks, but realize what this means. It means that at the biologic level, you are losing self-identity. And that's exactly what happens. You get leaky gut, leaky brain, leaky kidney tubules. Your body can't figure out what is self and what is the outside world. And so we are starting to realize that our own self-identity is wrapped up somehow in our relationship with the outside world, which is really cool. And I think mirrors our macro experience in relationship, is that you can't actually be in healthy relationship until you know yourself. And I would posit you can't be in a healthy grasp of what your self-identity is until you venture into relationship. And so this is very, I think, seen on the psychology and social level, just as we see it in the microbiology realm here. After autoimmune disease, then we see that dementia-like process. Again, by age 28 in the population, we can start to measure those deficits of sensory and memory processing. Vascular disease kicking in after the diabetes in our 40s and 50s. Cancer, of course, emerging at extremely young ages now. In our community, we just buried 2 kids with acute T-cell leukemias just in the last 4 days here. This very small community we have. So we're just so many children with cancer now. And of course, cancer in our adults. In my population of, again, 70 employees, we've got 4 or 5 people at any given time that have a family member that are struggling with a cancer. So the prevalence is just so extraordinarily dense in our population now. Dementia, of course, all of us are experiencing that by end of life. So that's kind of the cascade of leaky gut, leaky brain, loss of self-identity as we are increasingly exposed to these chemicals that erode this. Currently, the U.S. ranks 49th in the world for health outcomes. This is pathetic. We have like Croatia, a war-torn country that has very little infrastructure and is very early in its economic development, ranking at 40th. So they're well ahead of us in outcomes like death on day one, life expectancy, rates of cancer. They are so far ahead of us. Not only Croatia over there, but look at Chile whooping us. Chile has really got a progressive healthcare system, really doing a good job with prevention, really brilliant work done around the world. And we just are falling behind further every year. You know, and I've mentioned that age-old adage that thy food was thy medicine. And it turns out all these diseases that are missing have antidotes. They have the medicines that would treat autism and diabetes and pain and all of this would be treated, but it turns out that the same pathways that make the shikimate pathway, the same enzymes involved here, will go on to make the aromatic compounds that would include the medicinals in our food, which are the alkaloids. And so not only have we predisposed ourselves to disease, through the collapse of the microbiome, through the antibiotic components, and then expose ourselves to disease and inflammation through the collapse of the tight junctions, we then take away the medicines that would treat those diseases, all with the same chemical, glyphosate, at every level. This is where the story has to get better because it's starting to get pretty depressing. And so I want to bring some hope to you. Here we are spraying the surface of the earth with some 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate every year. I can't even really wrap my head around billions of kilograms, but 2 billions of kilograms into the soils of the earth. And what my lab has had the humbling journey to experience over the last decade is that we find in fossil layers of soil 60 million years ago that Mother Earth, as this kind of angel, this kind of covenant of grace over us, has planted in these fossil soils an antidote to that Roundup. And that just is so mysterious to me that she would have that kind of grace and patience with us. But what we have found and been working with is that the microbiome of the ancient world not only before humans got to the soils and started sucking life out of it, but even before that, if we look back to the fifth great extinction on Earth, which was the dinosaurs and their era, what happened at that time was a collapse of the soil ecosystem. That led to the loss of large animal life on the planet across the board. Dinosaurs were only the tip of the spear there. And so we had this massive loss of life around this event of death of the topsoil. And so we've gone past that 55 million year old extinction event back to 60 million years old to find soil levels that have this fossil record of what did the microbiome look like in those soils before these last two great extinctions, the first with the dinosaurs, the second, which we are engineering with our killing of the soil. What did it look like? And so we've been working with that to extract specifically what did the bacteria and fungi contribute to that soil. And it goes far deeper than the fats and sugars and proteins and micronutrients that we think of the bacteria making bioavailable to the human. Instead, in 2012, I found this molecule in a soil science paper and recognized that the three-dimensional structure on this end looked a lot like the chemotherapy that I used to work with, which did something called redox signaling or communication between the mitochondria, which are tiny little organisms that live inside of our cells and are responsible for cell repair and the prevention and management of cancer. And so the aha moment was, if that can be in soil outside of our cells, what could possibly make that? And when we found out that it was the bacteria and fungi making these molecules in millions of different variants, we suddenly had the mechanism by which changes in the microbiome could predispose to cancer. Changes in the microbiome could predispose to mood disorder or autoimmune disease or the rest. The mechanism that we uncovered was the biome is literally making the communication network of repair. And that has been an exciting journey to realize that human repair and cellular repair mechanisms that have been studied in infinitum in a sterile petri dish can actually completely be transformed, accelerated, and really supported intensely by the contribution of the microbiome, which has never been allowed to enter that biochemistry cell biology lab. And so we have been working with this. We call them the carbon snowflakes, each species, again, making some different variant thereof. And as a cohesive group of snowflakes, it creates a communication network. And that's become a huge supplement line, as well as we've got a line coming out for livestock. And it's very important to manage our cattle with the same microbial communication network, because our cattle are seeing some 10 to 100 times more Roundup in their feed than we see in our human food chain. And so they are being hammered. We have a line for pets because it turns out that the cats and dogs are eating dog food, that has as much as 400 parts per million of glyphosate. Again, about 100 times as much as you would see in human food. So the animals around us are suffering with their disease epidemics just as we are with ours, as we put them under greater and greater stress with their nutritional and this nutritional injury. So it's been an exciting journey. And what we've shown again and again under the microscope, and now more recently in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial in humans, we've been able to show that the small intestine that falls apart under glyphosate will zipper right back together in the presence of the communication network of the microbiome. That is an extraordinary message that human health and repair is reliant and responsive to a communication network that is non-human. That is so exciting and harkens back to this message that the genome and its microRNA of the microbiome can inform and change our genes. In the same way, the microbiome can produce redox biochemistry and the communication network that would result, that would accelerate our capacity to inform that genomics of the needs in regard to repair and mechanisms of prevention. This is a peer-reviewed study that we published out of here showing that we can reverse that glyphosate-mediated injury. You see the remarkable results of that paper here. This is baseline. If we give communication network, we can nearly double the protective quality of that gut. If instead we take the control membrane and add the glyphosate levels, we can see that huge collapse. If we add back the communication network of the microbiome at that point, we see that huge recovery to the point where actually they're better off. They're stronger, not weaker. And so we've returned them to an acute inflammatory environment where they got stronger from the insult, not weaker. This is showing the same phenomenon in gluten. Gluten, like glyphosate, can damage that gut membrane. But if you have the communication network of the ancient microbiome present, you see this rapid zippering up of that whole system, and you become very resilient against the gluten damage there. This is the peer-reviewed study that came out of that. I also want to bring in some more recent data from our lab, where we're now looking at the blood-brain barrier to show the same effect, that the human blood-brain barrier is actually managed again by the microbiome. If you add back the communication network of the bacteria and fungi, we double the strength of that neurologic barrier system, critical to prevention of damage and inflammation in our central nervous system. If you damage the gut with gluten, we see this collapse of the blood-brain barrier as well. This is a pretty cool study showing that if you take gluten, not only do you damage the gut, it immediately drops the potential of protection into your brain. So that's why you end up with brain fog and all the autonomic nervous system symptoms that are classic for gluten sensitivity, is because of this collapse of the blood-brain barrier. Excitingly, after that injury, we can return it not only to baseline, we can nearly double it again with the recovery phase in that acute inflammatory, reactive, and regenerative quality that we see nature providing all the time. So in summary here, we can show gluten, glyphosate, and any other toxins like alcohol and the rest, creating toxic peptides that will create the zonulin compound, go into tight junction damage. As you get leak, you get chronic inflammation. If we add back the communication network of the microbiome, we start to break down these toxic peptides and block their ability to produce zonulin in the tight junction leak across the system. Now, we've also gone a layer deeper to say, okay, after you zipper that gut together, what happens to your healing potential and things like your antioxidant pattern? And we've been able to show that at baseline, you make very little antioxidant in your small intestine and colon. And as soon as you add back the communication network, you have a huge improvement in glutathione production. So glutathione being the primary antioxidant, accounts for about 85% of your reservoir as a total body. So really profound effect, not just at the small bowel and colon, but we've shown it on liver cells as well. Ramp up that glutathione to get that abundant response. In our double-blind placebo-controlled trial, just in 2 weeks of oral usage of the communication network, we see the human clearing glyphosate more effectively, so that their urine by 2 weeks out has decreased its expression of glyphosate by 24%. So rapid improvement in your body's kind of burden of glyphosate over the course of the study. Also showing that zonulin decreased by almost that same 20% mark there. And so decrease in zonulin means less leak at the gut, less leak at the brain in just 2 weeks of communication across the system. Finally, we showed interleukin-6, which is a marker for inflammation, and we show that same statistically significant drop in inflammation. And remember, these are all unhealthy subjects. Tellingly, none of those healthy subjects entering the study were found to be clear of glyphosate. We could find Roundup in all of their urines across the board. And so the intense situation that we have with 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate worldwide is that we find 75% of our rain and 75% of our air that we breathe contaminated with this chemical. So you can try to eat organic all day long, but until we radically change our farming practices worldwide, we are going to be breathing it. It'll be raining on us. It'll land on our crops, regardless of farming practices, until we clean up this greater ecosystem and practice on the global level. So how do we heal? We really need to start to look at our bodies as organic gardens. We need to focus on the importance of vaginal birthing. If you are born by C-section or have a child born by C-section, it's important to recognize that you can recover this microbiome quickly just with a simple vaginal swab. Vaginal swab, mom's vaginal canal, big cotton swab, and then cover the baby's eyes, ears, nose, throat, rectum, skin. Get that kid coated in mom's organic garden. That vaginal mucosa is really the foundation for that child's trajectory of immune health and their ability to have normal autonomic nervous system function. In so doing, in that first couple hours of life, if you'll swab that kid down, you will add decades of life expectancy, I believe, and for sure maybe an entire lifetime of quality immune system and function and neurologic function as well. After vaginal birthing, I think the most important thing we can do for ourselves is breathe outside. Most of our microbiome seeding isn't coming from eating things, it's actually through just being in touch with nature. And so breathing outside in diverse environments, get into the woods, get up into the mountains, get by waterfalls, get by the ocean, get into as many ecosystems as you can in this depleted environment we have, so that you can find whatever niche organisms are left and try to repopulate that situation. So breathe outside, touch it, grow your own food. We have to start participating again at this grassroots level, at the literal level of that. Grow at least one plant this spring. Get a tomato plant in the ground, get a mint plant. Something needs to be growing. You need to somehow re-engage. At the end of World War II, we were growing 45% of our food chain in our backyard victory gardens. Now we grow less than 0.1% of our food in backyard gardens. And so we just outsourced, and the chemical companies responded by doing mega chemical farming. We need to be part of that fundamental solution by re-engaging our own food production systems. Grow your own gardens with your own hands. Stop spraying Roundup in the weeds. Remember how powerful it is to get that breath of air from that weed that you just pulled. There's spores and bacteria from the soil that are now airborne from that violent pulling of the weed, and you're interacting with that. It's informing your genome. It's literally changing the body you will build tomorrow by being in touch with that. The breath you take will change your genome. You don't like your health right now? Change your macro environment and you will change. You have to. Stand barefoot in the grass and soil. Get those rubber-soled shoes off. Connect with Mother Earth. It goes deeper than the microbiome. There's a little electrical connection that happens when skin touches Earth. This is why everybody feels better after a week at the beach, is the barefoot time on the sand reconnected you to that electrical energy, the natural cycles, everything from the moon cycle to the stars and the tides and everything, the day-night cycle, the respiratory rate of planet Earth itself, all dialed in to your feet through that touch. And so get naked would get you some extra credit there from me. Eat fermented foods every day. As of the 1950s, we phased out fermenting our foods and we just refrigerated everything. We need to get fermentation back in a natural cycle. Kimchi, that classic aperitif before the meal, a couple bites of fermented cabbage, and it would change the digestive quality and the health delivery of the following nutrients of the meal. The Koreans have known that for thousands of years. The Japanese, it's a little bit of miso soup right before the meal. That miso, incredibly intelligent system that's getting that fermentation back into your day and life. And finally, we need to hug, kiss, and generally celebrate every human, pet, and animal that you can touch. And that's going to get you a more diverse microbiome, a more diverse communication network of redox signaling. And finally, if you want one more big answer, is we need to engage as consumers to Farmer's Footprint. This is a nonprofit that I launched recently with some phenomenal minds around the world. We are partnering with some of the best teachers in regenerative ag out there to bring those resources in mass volume to consumers and farmers alike to create a regenerative movement that will change the world by 2025. If we don't do it by 2025, we are frankly going to be too late. And so we've got the clock ticking. We desperately need you to join this mission. So go to farmersfootprint.us, a great 22-minute documentary we'll kick that off so you can kind of see the big picture of where we're heading. And in these coming months, you're going to see a big system of support coming behind that website that's going to bring education to farmers and consumers alike, as well as economic support, a new insurance model for farmers to be able to insure their regenerative crops differently, and also then a private ownership and partnership team of financiers around the world where private equity can support farmers and help them get out of the codependent relationship with the banks that currently exist and keep them locked to the farm bill, which is making them grow sugar beets, corn, and soybean. And so we got to break the back of that financial codependence, and we're doing that with Farmers Footprint. So join us, get passionate, and finally, I want to thank my entire team, a brilliant group of scientists and people behind me here. So great appreciation to all of you for all you do to bring sustainability now.
Dr. Zach, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. The perspective that you bring is so profoundly enlightening on so many different levels. It's greatly appreciated.
You are so welcome. So grateful to be here. Thank you for doing what you're doing to get the message out.
Thank you. So I just want to ask you if you have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, I've got a hard stop in about 5 minutes, but if you want to hit for 5 minutes, I got it.
Okay, I wanted to ask you if the TerraHydrate is something that can be applied to restoring the land at all.
Yeah, very good question. We've got a product that's in test fields up in Minnesota now, recovering Roundup damaged soils. And our early data is showing return of earthworms and the matrix of the mycorrhizae, which is the precursor to the entire microbial recovery system, within 4 to 6 weeks. And this is soil that's been destroyed for 15 to 18 years with multi-year exposures to Roundup. And Roundup was sprayed on the field the day before we applied the product. So wow. Really, really powerful, again, antidote-like effect down there in the soil microbiome, just as you see in the human.
And that would be sprayed?
Yeah.
Okay, and do you combine it in any way with mycelium or mycorrhizae to enhance it, or?
You don't have to.
Wow.
It shows up almost instantly. It's already out there. It just needs a welcoming mat. And so we see TerraHydrate as the welcome mat to the microbiome, and it's the literal compost as well as the communication network. So there's nutrients in there that the bacteria and the mycorrhizae need. And once you get it back in there, the nutrients present, it shows up from the air itself.
Wow. Wow. And the other question is, you said you see a marked improvement in human health and in the land in 2 weeks. Does it continue to improve as the product is used?
Yeah, so we see the whole gamut. Obviously, the condition of the human, predicts largely the trajectory that we expect to see. Most patients, most individuals and consumers using the oral products are healthy people that are just working to become healthier. In our double-blind placebo-controlled trial, we went after those healthy subjects who had never seen the product before to show that we could reduce their inflammation even though they didn't have any symptoms of it. And
wow.
So that I think is the most exciting thing is whether you consider yourself super healthy and doing everything you can, or you have a health problem, there's a real rationale and proven out science behind why you would want to make this part of your daily routine.
I loved what you were talking about with the microRNA. It gives credibility to the way that a person can change the feeling in a room, that there's actually
Absolutely.
something physical happening. And you also gave a really powerful physiological explanation or justification for vegetarianism.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and if not vegetarianism, then certainly a complete transformation of meat production, right? We need to start to have these animals in reverence. We need to see them as an extension of ourselves and life on Earth. And we need to just totally change the way in which these animals are raised. I would love to see us phase out poultry production as a whole until somebody figures out how to do it more effectively on scale. But we cannot be serving chicken like this and expect to have anything but disease coming out of that chicken. So absolutely need for a plant-based approach. In my clinic, we teach plant-based nutrition, which means the vast majority of what you eat is plants. And occasionally, if you're going to eat meat, you need to know the source, and you try to eat as low on that food chain as possible. So I'd rather have you eat, a wild-caught sardine than a large salmon. The large salmon are, classically toxic for plastics and mercury and all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
There's a few places around the world where I think salmon is sustainably, fished by native peoples. Anytime we see anything but native peoples in the process of fishing or other meat production, we see a rapid departure from sustainable practices. So outside of native practices and your own fishing, I would say watch out for the fish. Above the level of a fish, you have got to know your farmer. If you're eating beef, you need to know that thing was completely grass finished, not grass raised. Grass raised is all cows. Grass finished is the key, and it has to be organic throughout its life cycle. Remembering again, that's a beef cow that's going to consume somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 gallons of water for every pound of beef. That means that rainwater and that glyphosate residue in the water system is going to filter 2,500 gallons through every pound of beef, which means you're going to have residues. And so because you're eating high in the food chain, it is very, very hard to find clean beef today. Certainly, I'd rather have you on a grass-raised, grass-finished cow from an organic garden than a CAFO feedlot. But we're already working with CAFO feedlots to try to reduce the stress of those animals while we're trying to teach the consumer to change their behavior. We just don't think there's any time to waste. So we're working with, through the pharmaceutical approach, we've got a drug approved. It's a supplement, terahydrite-based supplement, but you have to be regulated as a drug if you go into the food chain. So we went through the 3-year process of becoming a drug-regulated compound feed additive for the large animals. We're in our final dosing studies now with 11,000 cows up in Canada. In that study, all of our trials so far have shown incredible safety and amazing efficacy. So really exciting new era for beef production, but we hope it's really the tip of the iceberg for these ranchers and farmers to start to realize that the health of their cows actually does impact their bottom line beneficially. And we hope that that is the beginning of a process of really moving the entire meat protein industry towards a much more biodynamic and regenerative, restorative techniques that can really not only reduce the travesty of the animal welfare, but also improve the health of the consumer behind that piece of meat.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Keep the momentum going by checking out all the other experts. Every one of them has invaluable information that you can't afford to miss. Buy the Premium Summit package now. Join the global conversation in our Facebook group and take action in your home, community, or the world at large. Together, we will shape a world that works.